Thank you, Colin, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. Very excited and happy to share with you all some of our work in Karachi, where I was for the past 4 years before arriving in Medford in August. So before I start talking about sort of our work, I want to give you a little bit of context about Karachi, right? So Karachi is Pakistan's largest city. It is a coastal city of a population over 20 million people. It is Pakistan's financial hub as well, and it features an arid climate. So Karachi doesn't have any freshwater resources of its own. They have to pump in fresh water from Kinjhir Lake about 200 miles away. So you can already see sort of the stresses that exist in Karachi. Overseeing Karachi's water system is the Karachi Water and Sewerage Board. It's Karachi's sole water utility, the sole organization that's in charge of managing anything and everything to do with water and sewerage in the city of over 20 million people. Some challenges that are associated that this organization oversees. First, Karachi has what we call an intermittent pipewater supply. So here in Medford, when you go to the tap, you turn on the tap, you expect water to always flow there, right? You do this at 8 in the morning, 8 in the night, after midnight, you always expect water to be flowing in the taps. That is what we call a 24/7 system, right? Or a pressurized system. That is not the case in most megacities of the global south, especially in South Asia, where the water systems are typically intermittent pipe water supply, which means that at certain hours of the day or certain hours of the week, there is water in the pipelines, and the rest of the time, these pipes are empty, which you can think, and as we'll discuss what kind of problems that introduces. Coupled with that, Karachi's water infrastructure is sort of aging, and that leads to really high system losses. So estimates vary, but by some accounts, almost half or 50% of the water in the system is unaccounted for. The utility doesn't know where it's going. So it's not just the quantity of water that is a challenge in Karachi. The water quality in the pipes is also often shown to be of really poor quality, and that leads to a really high health disease burden when we sort of look at water challenges. And to top it all off, the water utility is extremely financially constrained. So forget about investing in the system to improve performance. They're unable to even maintain the system. They rely on federal and provincial subsidies to pay their salaries, which means that they're in this vicious downward spiral. So because of their low revenues, they're unable to improve their services, and which leads to continued deteriorating service, which means that the revenues also go down. And so it's in this very tricky situation. So given all of these challenges, what's interesting is that the water discourse in Karachi is very distorted. It's very interesting. There's this laser sharp focus or myopic focus on a narrative of water shortages and water scarcity. This is just a collection of some headlines that discuss Karachi's water challenges, all of which that look at Karachi's challenges from a lens of scarcity. What that does is that it focuses attention on the materiality of systems. So essentially, what that means is, build a pipeline, pour some concrete to solve all your challenges, right? You do that, and that, you sort of live happily ever after. This convinces policymakers and water managers to sign on to debt-laden infrastructure that ends up really serving only a minority of citizens and leaves behind all those challenges that I discussed earlier still standing there. Now, if you read anything about, or if you talk to anyone in Karachi about Karachi's water challenges, the first things, that first two numbers you're going to hear are these. So you'll hear that estimated water demand in Karachi, according to the water utility, is 1,100 MGD. MGD is million gallons of water a day. So that's a lot of water. But that's what the water utility estimates is what is needed in Karachi. And the next sentence right after that is what you'll hear is, what you'll hear is that the existing water supply in Karachi is about 600 million gallons of water, right? So, none of us need to be very good at math to see that these two numbers are very different. And of course, if the supply is 600 mgd and the demand is 1100 mgd, of course, there's going to be water challenges, right? You're right in asking, Hassaan, why are you making such a big fuss about this? Well, this 1100 million gallons of water a day number is based on an assumed water usage of 55 gallons per day per capita. I know I'm giving you a lot of numbers, but forget everything. I just want you to commit this number to memory, right? 55 gallons of water per person per day. That's what the water utility estimates is what the water usage in Karachi is. And they say, well, Karachi has roughly 20 million people. You multiply 55 by 20 million, you get 1100 mgd. Now, there are some problems. First, this number is not based on any evidence. It is a completely made up number. So household water connections in Karachi are not metered. So the utility has no way of knowing how much water households are actually using in their houses. And sort of when you press them further, there isn't really any academic source, any study that they quote. It's just a number, a rule of thumb sort of thing that they've adopted based on studies in other big cities similar to Karachi. The other big problem with this number is that it's uniform, right? So Karachi has really, really brutal summers, right? So in the summers, temperatures average over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for many months, right? So you sweat a lot. You want to sort of take a lot of showers. There's a high, you do a lot of laundry. And the winters, it's relatively milder, cooler. So at least anecdotally, your water usage is going to be very different. But this number, this constant number of 55 gallons per capita per day, doesn't sort of account for any of that variability, nor does it account for any of the socioeconomic disparities that exist in Karachi, right? So I said Karachi is a city of over 20 million people. They live different lives, right? This number doesn't account for any of that. In fact, if anything, it's really unrepresentative because most of Karachi, at least more than half of Karachi's population, lives in informal settlements, right? So these aren't sort of the typical settlements that we're used to seeing, sort of planned housing and residential areas. These are really sort of these sort of informal settlements that have sort of grown over time. More than half the city lives there. It's really unlikely there that anyone's using 55 gallons per capita per day there. So there's a big need for reliable estimates regarding water use at the household level. You want to inform urban water management because these numbers, 1100 mgd, 600 mgd, that's what's being used to justify really expensive water infrastructure projects worth billions of dollars. And if you're going to spend that much money, at least you want to know that that's something that's actually needed. So today I'll talk about two studies that aim to help us answer this question. So in this first study, we have three major objectives. The first objective is that we're trying to design a cost-effective smart flow meter that is able to measure and remotely transmit flow information in real time to a central server. So smart flow meters are available off the shelf, just sort of not any sort of super new technology, but they can be expensive. And especially when you think of Karachi and sort of the relatively low sort of budgets that these utilities are working with, we wanted to design a water flow meter at a fraction of the cost that's commercially available. Then we wanted to install and operate these devices across households in Karachi. And then using sort of from the large data sets that we're able to gather, use machine learning approaches to develop models of household water use, identify factors that influence water use. I worked with a very accomplished team of electrical engineers and computer scientists to develop this smart device that sort of comprises of an ESP32 microcontroller. There's a paddle flow sensor. You've got communication modules with both Wi-Fi and GSM capabilities and on-unit battery. Sort of a lot of work that went into sort of designing something, again, that is reliable, but also sort of cost-effective, sort of tested out to sort of acceptable standards. And if there are any sort of electrical engineers or people inclined towards technology. You can sort of read more about this in our IECon 2022 conference paper. So, we thought that, once we had our device made and, sort of it took us a lot of time, that we had sort of overcome the most difficult part of our project, and that we could sort of now get into the fun stuff. What we didn't realize was that how difficult it would be to convince volunteer or participant households to actually allow us to install these devices in their houses. So, sort of we had massive outreach campaigns to, sort of over social media, WhatsApp messages, emails, university announcements, word of mouth, to really reach out to people and ask them, hey, man, sort of you volunteer for this study, it's this really cool thing that we're trying to do. And out of the thousands of people we reached out to, we had a couple of hundred people who were like, yeah, I'm interested. Let's sort of, I'm happy to sort of partner with this. The problem is that in housing layouts and electrical layouts and plumbing layouts in Karachi vary tremendously. There isn't sort of any standardized sort of procedures that people follow. So it's really ad hoc, right? So each house has a very different setup. And so what was needed was for us, we had to sort of visit every interested household to actually ascertain whether or not our device could actually even function there, right? Could be installed there or function there. And sort of out of those 200 houses, let's say that we visited, this would take a couple of days to actually set up. You want to go on the weekends, you go on the weeknights when people are around. There's a very small percentage of houses that actually were fit for sort of our purposes. That's what we realized. And so so from 200, we were already, so starting off with the thousands, we narrowed down to a couple of hundred people who were interested. From that, we sort of got down to about 50 who we could even sort of, the device could actually be technically installed there. Then we had sort of the trouble where they got cold feet, right? Where it was like, because water connections in Karachi are not metered, they're like, what's the point of having this meter? Am I sort of going to see a bigger bill? Are you sort of this undercover agent of the water utility? And so, sort of a lot of people sort of backed out at that point as well. Anyways, so from those who did end up sort of consenting, we ended up sort of incentivizing households, making sort of payments to sort of incentivizing them to sort of consent. Ended up sort of installing the devices and then continued maintenance. We also carried out surveys in these households to understand, sort of how many people live there, education, so demographic factors, socioeconomic characteristics. So at the end, we were able to install these devices in 25 households across Karachi. Before I get into the results, because I see a lot of students here, I think it's interesting. I want to sort of spend a couple of minutes just discussing the kind of research challenges that we encountered, and the kind of challenges that you encounter when you sort of maybe do a lot of international research. So the first thing that I mentioned, sort of this lack of trust from participants. That's generally true, wherever you're doing research, but especially true in sort of areas of the global south where there isn't a lot of interaction between sort of researchers or academia with the sort of general public. Of course, COVID happened while this sort of project was going on, right? And this isn't something that lends itself well to remote work, right? You need sort of access to the lab as you're designing this device and testing it out and installing it. All of this sort of requires in-person presence. So just COVID disruptions are a big challenge. There's a lot of variations in field conditions that I described. Our device worked perfectly well in the lab, right? Sort of we had our lab set up, sort of we tested all kinds of different pipe sizes, temperatures, did all the whole thing. But then when you sort of go out in the field, you kind of sort of see see a lot of the unknown unknowns, right? And sort of then it's a matter of sort of figuring that out. We ran into sort of unreliable power supply or network connectivity, things that we didn't really, or that we just assumed would be something that would be easily available, but wasn't. As we were working on this project, there's a lot of political instability in Pakistan, which also ended up sort of translating into some economic instability. To cut a long story short, the government had to introduce a ban on all imports because the country was running out of sort of foreign exchange to sort of run the economy. which meant that even though our device we were sort of putting together and manufacturing ourselves, we relied on some components that had to be sort of brought or imported from elsewhere, sort of certain chips or sort of microcontrollers. And that's something that sort of really, again, was not something at the start of the project that we had even thought about or sort of had to contend with. And that economic challenge ended up sort of getting to our funding agency as well. So this project was funded by Pakistan's Higher Education Commission. Essentially, think of Pakistan's equivalent of the NSF, and they ran out of money, right? Like the funding agency didn't have money, and so all projects had sort of their research budgets, sort of cut by 33%. So was ours, and our research, sort of funds were, the disbursement of that was delayed by about 7 or 8 months, right? So the reason I sort of mentioned this is not to sort of discourage people or sort of, talk about sort of how difficult this work is, but actually sort of, it is something, it's important to acknowledge that these challenges exist when doing a lot of the international research. And it's actually these challenges why that kind of work is even more important. Because at the end, what we've now come up with, even though it's smaller than what we'd sort of hoped to have, but we have 25, we had 25 devices across Karachi, sort of installed in different settings, sort of measuring water usage at the 30-second interval, right? And over the course of a year. So we've got a really large data set on household water use that, forget about Karachi, doesn't even exist. It's the first of its kind for Pakistan at all. Like, so Pakistan's the 5th biggest country in the world. And so that kind of information, even though this is smaller than our initial target of the number of households we want to reach out to, it's still the first of its kind data set. And so we've got sort of work ongoing in terms of sort of dissecting or digesting a lot of that data. But I'll show you some sort of, so this is sort of the dashboard we had up that, households that volunteered to have the device installed, they could sort of in real time see their water usage. So this is one of those things that we use to incentivize households. But just sort of some preliminary interesting findings. So across the 25 households, I just very quickly right now made this is again ongoing analysis that we're working on. But what we see here is the per capita usage across the 25 households that we have. And this red line represents that number, right? The 55 gallons per capita per day number. And what we see is that for most of the houses, there's only a couple of the houses that use sort of 55 gallons per capita per day or more. Most of the households use significantly less on a per capita basis compared to the assumed usage that the water utility has of what people are using. But this data set, has a lot of information yet that we're sort of still trying to parse through, right? We have very high resolution data, which means that, we can sort of see how water use varies. Like, so this is for a particular node and how the water use is varying across the day for varying days. But we are already starting to see, sort of patterns in daily water usages, how water use varies across a week, across seasons, right? So we're seeing, sort of a significant seasonality in terms of winter water usage and then summer water usage. But this is ongoing work. I'm actually very excited to be working with a couple of Tufts students now, some students out of the data science program, who are sort of now helping me sort of, understand and gain some insights out of this work. But here's an important caveat. These smart devices, we realize, are useful in households that have modern plumbing, right? So what we think of, when you turn on the shower, like when you have to take a shower, you turn a knob and there's water that flows from a shower head. Or if you want to wash your hands, you turn on the tap and wash your hands. That's what I call modern plumbing. That's what's required for a smart water meter to actually work, right? You need sort of have plumbing. But that's not actually the case for a lot of households in Karachi. Remember, I told you more than half of Karachi lives in informal settlements. And in these informal settlements, they're not showering using shower heads. They're collecting water in different storage containers and using water out of those. No meter can get you that information, right? And so what that means is that 25 households that I was talking about isn't really representative of Karachi's population, right? It misses out on this large chunk of population that's not sort of using water like this. And so that was the premises, or sort of the instigator for our second study, where we wanted to look at low-income households and try and understand water use in those households. And so this work was recently published, and you can read more about that. But in terms of objectives, we used low-income neighborhood in Karachi as a case study, and we had sort of two major things that we were trying to do. We were trying to quantify and explain disaggregated water use behaviors. In simple words, we wanted to know, how do people use water in households in low-income neighborhoods, and how much water do they use? And we wanted to identify important socioeconomic factors that determine the level of water use. So to do this, we chose Liari as our case study. So Liari is this low-income neighborhood that is really at the tail end of Karachi's water system, which makes it especially vulnerable to a lot of the water challenges. It has a population of just under 1 million people. And it's the size of something smaller than Somerville, right? So it's very highly densely populated settlement. In terms of methodology, we carried out household surveys and informal interviews over 2 rounds of surveys. So we had sort of survey questionnaire that talked about or asked about socio-demographic and socioeconomic factors, but also included with that was a water use questionnaire, right? So where we asked respondents about their water use habits, sort of questions like how many times do you shower, how many times do you flush, how long does it take to sort of wash dishes, and so on. And then we coupled that with sort of measurings, the size of the water containers that they were sort of using, and if there was any sort of taps that they were using, measuring flow rates of that, to come up with this metric that we call reported water use. I don't call it water demand because it's very different, and I'll talk about how water demand is different from water use. But this was sort of the estimated water use that we had for each household. Keep in mind, because we're not relying on meters to tell us what the water use is. We're relying on people's memory and recall, and so there's definitely a limitation here that in terms of their ability to recall, but also any implicit biases that might come into their responses. That's a limitation that's important to keep in mind. So we carried out 2 rounds of surveys, one in the summer of 2021 and another following in the winter of 2021 and 2022, because we wanted to assess the seasonality of water use, if the water use is really impacted by the seasons. So there's just sort of some summary statistics for the 2 rounds of surveys that we had. We had about 2/3 of our respondents were female, 1/3 identified as male. About 90% of population across Liari has access to pipelines. Okay, so now let's look at some sort of headline numbers. Remember that number that I asked you to remember at the start, right? 55 gallons per capita per person. Well, for Liari, from our water use questionnaire across about 600 households, what we see is that the median sort of water use is about 16 gallons per person per day. And which drops to 13 gallons in the winter, right? So that's both of these numbers significantly lower than the 55 gallons per capita per day that the water utility assumes that people are using. In terms of how they're using this, so in the summers, most of this usage is really 2/3 of it is accounted for in bathing and flushing. And then we sort of see similar patterns in the winter, but really, so the proportion of water used in bathing and laundry and house washing goes down a little bit. There are a couple of activities that were sort of relatively unchanged between the summers and winters. It's important to understand these all represent indoor water use because there is no outdoor water use. There are no sort of lawns to water. There are no sort of landscaping water needs. So a lot of different things are happening on this figure, but essentially what this is showing water use that is disaggregated across different activities. So 5 different activities across seasons, and then across the reported gender of the respondent, right? So there are a few interesting things there. What we see is, again, sort of water use generally sort of goes or decreases in the winters. we see that, sort of, we don't see a lot of change in certain sort of flushing or stuff like dishwashing generally doesn't change significantly over the course of the summers and the winters. But there are certain activities like house washing. This is something that we hypothesized would be sort of fairly, agnostic to season, right? You kind of need to clean your house about the same that you do in the summers and the winters. But that's not what we saw. We saw that their house washing water uses were a lot higher in the summer. And in our interviews, we understood why. We realized why that was the case, because people weren't just using water to clean their premises in the summers. Water was also doing another key job. So it gets really hot in Karachi in the summers, and these households don't have air conditioning. Oftentimes there are power outages. So the use of water is actually as a cooling mechanism, right? So you sprinkle water across your house, across the floor, across the walls, and then the evaporative effect that it creates, that sort of creates a little bit of cooling. And so that's why there's sort of this seasonal signature that we see in the house washing water use as well. In this figure, what we're seeing is this scatter plot shows on the x-axis the reported water supply that they were receiving. Again, remember, this is an intermittent pipe water supply system, so it's not, they don't have water all the time. They have water at, for a few minutes or a few hours during the week. So that's on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we've got the reported water use, both on logarithmic scales. And a couple of things, and the houses, the shade of the dot represents this season in which these houses were surveyed. A couple of interesting things in the summer, as the water supply, available water supply increases, the reported water use also goes up, right? And this trend is statistically significant. That's not the case for the winters. That trend line isn't statistically significant. In simple words, that says that in the summers, every additional drop of water that becomes available, households use it. So household water use is very constrained by the supply. And now this gets to the idea of why I'm using the term reported water use and not water demands, right? Because the water demand might be higher than what the actual water use is. The water use is constrained by the actual water supply. But generally what we see is that this demand is higher in the summers. So water demands are higher in the summers than they are in the winters. And that's sort of, you can sort of see that when you look at this extreme end of people who report always having water available, they tend to sort of use more in the summers than the people who always have water available in the winters as well. Okay, on this, there are a few different things happening. Again, on this, you've got the x-axis, you've got the reported water supply that's available. But on the y-axis, this is now representing households' reported sufficiency level, right? So we asked households to rate on a 5-point scale how sufficient they felt that their water supply was, with 5 being the most sufficient, 1 being insufficient, the least sufficient. And the size of the dots represents the reported water use in each household. So something sort of that's fairly obvious from this, scatter plot that you're seeing is, as water supply increases, generally the reported sufficiency goes up. Makes sense, intuitive. As sort of people have more water supply, they tend to rate it as more sufficient. What's interesting is, and that sort of not always, but often enough, is also associated with higher water use. What's interesting is this is just for the summers. When you look at something similar for the winters, what we see is that between this figure and this figure, statistically, there's no difference between the water supply in the summers and the winters. So essentially, that is to say, the water supply that Lafayette receives in the summer is about the same as the water supply that it receives in the winter. But because demands in the winter go down, now a lot of more people describe their supply as being sufficient, right? So again, sort of indicating a lower demand for water, right? Because efficiency is sort of both a function of this water supply and the demand. Yeah. Okay. So what are some implications of these findings, right? From the studies and sort of now tying it back to what I was talking about at the start. First thing is, across both low-income households and middle to high-income households, what we're seeing is not a lot of households actually in low-income houses. Nobody's using 55 gallons per capita per day. And in medium to high-income housing, that's also sort of fairly rare. That's not to say that there isn't, so that's not to say that existing water supply in Karachi is sufficient to meet its water needs, but it does indicate that the disparity between demand and supply isn't as extreme or as sort of high as the initial shock that you get when you look at 1100 mgd, 600 mgd. You're like, you almost sort of only get half the water that you need, and so of course that's going to be a challenge. This is important for two reasons. First is that this low supply of water is a very convenient and deployed as a very convenient excuse by the water utility to explain away their poor performance, right? So, sort of when you've got unreliable water supply, or when you've got sort of, not sort of some areas getting sort of almost no water and actually no water, the default response is, of course, our demand is 1100 mgd, our supply is only 600. Of course, this is going to happen, right? And, once we have this new supply augmentation plan installed, everything will be fine, right? So it's a very convenient excuse. And what we're seeing is that isn't really, that disparity isn't that high, right? But more importantly, it raises questions about the expensive water infrastructure projects that the city is investing in. For the past 20 years, they've been trying to build this really, you think of Karachi's equivalent of the Big Dig, right? For the past 20 years, it's sort of billions of dollars worth of a pipeline being installed. Like I mentioned, because Karachi doesn't have its own freshwater resources, so it has to, keep on going farther and farther away to procure more and more water. For a poor water utility that doesn't have enough money to pay its salaries, that doesn't really make sense to be spending this much money for mega water supply projects that you're not quite sure that you need, right? Or sort of the needs of those might be exaggerated. Maybe it might be better if they focus their attention on sort of management interventions, or things in pricing reforms, or sort of ensuring access and equity in water access. But that's not what the water utilities focus is, because of this narrative of water scarcity driven by this 1100 versus 600 number. Everything is all about sort of pouring more concrete to build more pipelines, to get more water into the city, because that's going to solve everything. And every time a new pipeline is installed, we see time and time again, the existing challenges largely remain, right? Like it doesn't sort of, isn't the silver bullet that people think it is. It's also ironic that the water utility, claims that people need 55 gallons per capita per day, but especially in the low-income neighborhoods, they don't provide anything close to that, right? We're seeing, 16 gallons, 13 gallons is sort of the water that's really available for households. But it's also important to keep in mind that these are the existing water uses really only meet basic needs, right? So, our understanding of sort of improvements in living standards, that sort of water use can be reasonably expected to increase going forward. So some takeaways. Sort of water use in low-income households, especially, is significantly lower than what the water utility estimates. There's significant variation. It's not uniform. The water use isn't uniform. There's significant variation based on seasons, based on supply schedule, based on sort of who's using this, socioeconomic and demographic features as well. Another sort of important thing that I want to highlight as I end is sort of this idea, as you're doing research, especially in sort of these understudied regions, what we took, or what we sort of learned really, was the importance of tailoring our research methods and approaches to the local context, right? When we thought that technology or these smart devices might be sort of the thing that would get us all the answers, we realized, sort of that wasn't the case. And, it really requires a really interdisciplinary approach to problem solving when it comes to water. Yeah, and I don't want to end before sort of acknowledging a huge army of really talented and hardworking undergraduate researchers who worked on this project, who made sort of all of this work possible. I also show this to encourage the undergraduate students here. I'm always interested in working with students. A lot of our projects are ongoing, and there are openings for student researchers. So if any of you are interested in sort of water systems or sort of international research relating to sort of water, please do reach out. Like I'm new here, so I'm sort of looking forward to sort of getting to work with the undergrads here at Tufts. Yeah, and as Colin mentioned, next spring I'll be teaching a course on water cross-listed between UEP and environmental studies. It's this three-part course. We talk about sort of water in the environment, sort of the water cycle, talking about groundwater, surface water, droughts, floods, water and climate, understanding the science of it, but then really then getting into the societal aspects of, conflicts over water. How do you allocate water across competing uses, agriculture, energy, domestic water? What happens when a country builds a dam? How do downstream countries react to it? And how do we sort of negotiate those conflicts? And then finally, students work on developing, sort of a water management plan for 25 years for a city of their choice, right? So we go through that process as well. So it's this interdisciplinary course. The goal here is to really introduce students to the world of water, and we'll have seats reserved for environmental studies students as well. So I hope to see many environmental students in that course. Great. I'll stop at this point and happy to take any questions. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much. I'd be happy to bring the mic to you if you have a question.
Thank you, Hassaan, for walking us through your research. I think after all this information, it begs the question, what the utilities say about your results?
Yeah, it's just very interesting. So when some of our works come out, I sent it or shared it within our circles, and like a few hours later, I got a call from the CEO of the water utility, so it's fair to say it's, and it's fair, like the way I presented it maybe sort of gives an idea that, sort of this water utility is sort of evil and trying to sort of do that, but that's not the case, so they're very well-meaning people trying to, sort of understand this better. They don't have the resources to, sort of do all this work to figure out sort of what the water demands are. For them, this becomes slightly inconvenient in terms of, sort of a lot of their justification for project funding is affected by that. So they've been so this is part of the overall, bouquet of research that we're doing on Karachi. This is work that they're not very interested in. They're sort of more interested in our work on pricing and billing, which is more of their focus. But that's something I'm hoping that this discourse, especially as sort of more of our work comes out and more attention goes on water demand, sort of maybe the public discourse starts to shift a little bit. I think that's really when the water utility sort of responds to that. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Thorne. I'm at the nutrition school. Really interesting talk. Two questions. One is, I was wondering if you could kind of give us a better picture of what an informal settlement is, because I was thinking tents, but you're talking, there's references to flushing, so like clearly that's a different kind of setup. The other is kind of to dig it more into this question of what is true demand, because if only people's very basic needs are being met, and what is a fulfilled life, and how does that map to water use? And so I was wondering if you could comment on that more.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'll talk about the second one first, and then so in terms of true demand, you're absolutely spot on, right? Like again, what we're showing here were water uses, not actual water demands. They were very constrained in this supply that we got. But it's also interesting, we also looked at the subset of households that reported having water always available. There were households, a sizable number of households who reported that, and who reported a sufficiency rating of 5. So they were very satisfied or thought that their water supply was very sufficient and reported always having it available. And even their water uses were somewhere on the order of about 25 gallons per person per day, right? So higher than the median, but still significantly lower than what the water utility assumes. So we are able to understand a little bit about the true demands through those subsets of users. But you're absolutely right, like going forward, as we think about sort of different or, improving living standards, that water or true water demand is likely to increase. Regards to your first question about informal settlements, what makes an informal settlement? That's a $1 million question, right? And that's actually one of the studies that we have going on as well. It's easy to, I think in sort of popular understanding, informal settlements sort of refer to, there are different types of informal settlements. So you have settlements where you've got waves of migrations happening. So like, for example, for Karachi, after 1947, when the British ended sort of their colonial rule over the Indian subcontinent, there's a mass migration of people into Karachi, right? And you had all these people now sort of looking to find a place. They started off by pitching in tents, right? And sort of finding empty space, but they're able to sort of then build up basic infrastructure in terms of laying some pipelines, some sewage pipelines, sort of paving streets and whatnot. And so but that process of migration and moving hasn't stopped. Like, it wasn't that it only happened in 1947, right? Then there have been sort of really phases. In 1971, Pakistan had sort of this huge breakup, essentially, when East Pakistan and West Pakistan, became two separate countries, the country of Bangladesh and Pakistan. And so there's a huge influx of migrants into Karachi at that point as well. Then there was the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where a lot of Afghan refugees came to Pakistan, and generally Karachi, being the financial hub, attracts all the migrants. And so there have been subsequent waves of migrations into Karachi. And so you've got informal settlements at various stages of development, for the lack of a better word, right? Where you've got well-established informal settlements where you've got sort of flush toilets, or you've got sort of paved streets, but you also have sort of this really, really recent informal settlements where you've got a group of people who are sort of pitching under a large flyover, right, or next to sort of a sewage stream. And so it's hard to say, like, there isn't one thing that is categorized as informal settlements. There's a sort of a spectrum of households that would be described as informal settlements. Yes.
I have a quick question. I was fascinated by you're pointing out that we really need more water studies, that how hard it is to do the research makes it all the more important we do it. And you highlighted some of the challenges of the internal funding with the COVID and the economy. What are, like, as you look at the water landscape globally, where do organizations like yours perhaps try to get funding that is both local and global in nature? Like, what are the funding streams that might be UN associated or USAID, or, where would you go for funding if you wanted to have another source?
I think that's a question that I think about a lot. But you sort of mentioned a couple of really active sources of funding. USAID. There's a lot of work, especially when it comes to WASH, sanitation, hygiene, that sort of funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You've got the World Bank, who's also sort of interested in answering some of these questions. So oftentimes it's these large international organizations, but oftentimes the challenge is that they're not just interested in supporting research. They're often sort of, very interested in targeted policy interventions and outcomes, which makes it difficult. And that's why, it's not as if USAID or the World Bank or sort of different international organizations haven't funded development work in Karachi. But oftentimes, because it's sort of very target oriented and outcome oriented, it sort of skips that step of understanding what's going on, right? And sort of, just builds on a lot of assumptions of, this is how much people use, and this is how people use stuff. And so, sort of that gap still remains.
We have a question on the line.
Yeah. Kathy says, thanks for this fascinating talk. I'm wondering if the estimated need figure is also shaped by world-class city aspirations or models held by people in political leadership. as seems to be the case in some other cities with similar water challenges. Is that partly what's driving the investment in big new infrastructures?
Absolutely. That is definitely a huge factor. I think, so the World Bank a few years ago did this study where they wanted to invest in Karachi's infrastructure to make Karachi a world-class city. What that means is not really clear, but, sort of that is definitely a huge driving force in, sort of, exaggerating the actual needs or sort of assuming higher needs than they are to justify really, capital intensive water infrastructure projects.